What's up, guys? How's it going? Thank you for joining me on this Tuesday evening. As mentioned in my post earlier today, I'm going to be doing a live rendering of this truck. And I can see my computer screen at the same time, so if you guys have any questions while I'm working, please let me know. There was a little bit of lag and a little bit of latency, but hopefully that won't mess things up too much. So anyways, I'm going to be doing a rendering of this truck, but not this exact sketch. This is the sketch that I posted this morning, and this is the cleaned up version that I'm going to be working on tonight. To me, it's usually pretty important to start with a clean sketch before we do a full rendering. I could render over this, but there's going to be trade-offs. And if I want to do something clean, I'll render straight over something clean. If I don't have a whole lot of time and I just want to do something for fun, I can render straight over this. But otherwise, I'm going to just get right into it. I've already got markers and airbrush paints picked out. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore my phone and get right into it. Excuse me while I pick some pieces up here. Alright, so since I already know what colors I'm going to use, I'm actually just going to jump right into it. I decided that this truck is going to look really good red, so I'm just going to start putting in some red. And I tend to run most lines freehand. So you'll see later in the process I'll start to tighten things up with some more tools. But generally I'm going to try to freehand as much as possible because I think the lines look a little bit more elegant. And of course trying to do smooth marker strokes so that I can fill everything in as cleanly as possible. Come back and hit a couple edges while everything is still wet. And the process of doing something like this is a lot of layering of inks. So what's here now, I might change a little bit, I might adjust depending on where I think the values need to be. But initially, we just need to start blocking some tones. And the particular type of markers that I'm using are really, really wet markers. So I'm trying to be careful to move quick and be a little bit more deliberate with the marker strokes. Alcohol markers are a little bit more forgiving in a stage like this, but these are xylene-based markers, so they're really, really wet. Which means they blend really good, and they lay down color really good, but because they're really, really wet, some of the edges are going to bleed out while I'm working, and I'm going to work on those later. The important thing now is to just get these big color areas in first, and I can worry about some of the details of stuff like that a little bit later on. And when I'm doing something really quick like this, I'm not initially worried about staying inside the lines too much. What's up? How's it going? Thanks for coming by. So yeah, initially I'm not too worried about staying in the line so much. I mean, I want to stay within the confines of my line sketch. If I were to work from my earlier line sketch, I would have way more room for error because of how messy the sketch was. But here, especially because I know that I'm going to do a bunch of different passes with a bunch of different markers, and I'm also going to be using airbrush paints and pencils. So initially what I want to do is get some of these large areas covered and filled anyways, and not overly worried about, I mean, I'm being sort of careful, and I'm probably being a little bit being sort of careful for sure, but you know, that doesn't mean that it's super easy, I guess. Maybe I make it look easy, I don't know. Or maybe it doesn't look that easy. But the other thing is, I always make up my lighting from scratch, so I'm not looking at a reference. I'm not trying to figure out what I should mimic and otherwise. I'm putting color where I want color to go based on how I'm imagining I'm going to do the reflections and everything else. And just kind of creating some of these bubbly strokes just to create a little bit more light bend in the effect. Red is kind of I think it's a simple color to render, so sometimes in something that I consider to be a little over simple, I might busy up the reflection look just a little bit more so it doesn't end up being boring. Everything just solid red, it doesn't tend to be that interesting to look at least in my opinion. And we can get a bunch of different values out of one marker, but I'm gonna use some other tricks to change the values here because I'm on a different type of marker paper at the moment than the one that I used for the last demo. Alright, so notice I've avoided the roof because I'm actually going to do the roof in a different color. I've already kind of got a color scheme in my mind, and I'm trying to be deliberate with what I'm doing based on the choices that I need to make the color scheme work. In my mind, I'm already imagining like I could do the smoothies in an off-white, the same as the roof, so that we kind of have a nice little, a bit of a classic look to the overall. But that means I want to avoid putting red in areas that I can't fix later, because that will really affect the way an off-white will look if we have a little too much red somewhere. It's not a good look. Not a good look. Alright, jamming right along. It might seem sort of unusual, some of the marker strokes that I'm doing, but they're based on just some practice and some experience of how I want to bend the light around the color. Which the more times I try to explain that, the more obtuse it seems. Maybe I just think it's simple, and it's not. I don't know. You notice I'm leaving a lot of areas open. Not many. Red is a vibrant color. What's up, Eric Trolls? Red is a pretty vibrant color, so I don't need to leave a ton of room for what the next color will be, the next transition color, because I'm going to do a bunch of airbrushing in these open areas, and I could use like more pink marker to get it there, but I want those areas to be extra vibrant. So I'm going to hold off, and I'm going to do those areas with an airbrush, just to kind of get the most out of them as possible. Marker on paper, the ink is always going to dry into the paper a little bit, so you're just going to get a little bit of desaturation by doing that. And so in the later process where I am airbrushing, we'll be able to get some of that back, and I can kind of break down that process when we get there. I'm jumping ahead a few steps, but right now the important thing is to block in this main color. And already the color reads the shape of the truck, and that's what's important. We want the color to indicate the shape and the reflections. And some colors allow that to happen a little easier than others. Red is not super forgiving in that way, which is why I'm going to lean on doing a bit more airbrushing and a bit more of the contour with some of these other values that I'm going to break out in just a second. Because more or less, that's all the red. That's all we need right here. And the red is essentially done. So I'm going to cap that and stick that to the side so that I can get to the next thing. And while we're already at the stage with the red, I'll go ahead and break out a tone marker to go over top of this. And what I'll do sometimes, see, I always keep an extra marker pad on the side so that I can test markers to make sure that they're good before I start hitting my illustration. Because the last thing that I want to find out is I've got a dead marker right in the middle of something I'm doing. Or the cases when I just did there, something too saturated, which happens as well. So, give me a moment while I'm testing some markers off screen. Alright, so I'm essentially going over the red that I already did with some basic gray. This will help create a little bit more value, but that stays in the family. there's a little bit of a purple tint to basic grays in Chartpak, and what it'll kind of give me is this a bit more richness right where the color core needs to be. And even just airbrushing will make some difference in how this looks, but I prefer to do as much with markers as possible before I break out the airbrush, so I don't have to do too much back and forth. To me, there's not really like a right and a wrong way to do this. But if I can get a lot of this value and color done before I break out the airbrush, then I have to do less work with the airbrush. Not that I mind. Alright, so already we got some more value in the red, which is good. That's what we needed. So because markers are dye-based, we're essentially going over one color with another color. They're transparent, so they will build on top of each other. And as long as you're conscious of staying in the color family, they won't get too muddy. Airbrush seems horrible and scary to me. One day I'd like to try it when I have the money to buy a machine. Totally worth doing. It will really, really help, and I'll show that in a later stage. I always use brown over my red to darken it up, which you can. I was going to use a warm gray, but I opted to use the basic because it leans a little bit purple, just because it's a little bit more interesting. But actually, in the case of a red so saturated, you can almost get away with anything. And I'm just going to go over with a little bit more of a different value here to bring that down. Yep, alright, so, and then afterwards, I'll just go back in with the same red, because now we've sort of taken a little bit of the color out of it. And most marker papers will allow you a bit of pickup put down. This is a particular type of marker paper that is not as forgiving as some of the other ones that I use, but sometimes I like to switch back and forth just to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. Like sometimes you can do something for a while and forget some of the tricks, so I just want to make sure. And going back over with the red again, even though I'm not really resaturating into the areas, I'm adding a bit more red over top of that grayed red. So now, instead of having like the muddy look, which can happen, we're kind of putting those two tones together and making something right on the paper, which works so long as you know what your target is. But if you haven't done it, don't experiment on an illustration. Do a test piece first. And even a lot of this will get way more saturated with the airbrushing. And I'll still be able to build more value with some airbrushing as well. But I like where this is at, because it already has a bit more shape to it. Even though it kind of looks a little bit weird on the screen, actually. The color correcting camera is like not the best. But anyways, moving right along. So more or less got the red where I want. Let me try to move a little bit more of this. I'll have to do a demo sometime of just different types of paper and what they allow. Because some papers do what I call pick up put down, and some are set on top ink papers, which this one's a pretty good example of. It's bleed proof, so it's not going to go to the other side, which is great, but sometimes you would want ink to go to the other side. But topic for another time. Alright, switching back to my grays here, just to give this a little bit of value. When you're adding value to lower areas, putting back the color saturation isn't necessarily necessary. Because usually lower reflections will have less saturation anyways. Alright, so more or less got the red where I want. So I can switch over to, let's say, the roof area, which I already know is going to be an off-white. So I'm going to use a Chartpak gray. And actually, before I put any ink down, I'm going to put a little bit of blender down first, so that the ink has something to run into. and it will naturally feather just by having the by putting blender down first. And while that's still a little bit wet, I'm going to add a little bit more value with the next shade of gray, number 2 here. And if you work in the marker areas while they're wet, they're going to blend into each other anyways, and that can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. And oftentimes you see me, if you're somewhere where I'm working out in public, you see me jumping back and forth between several different markers as quickly as I can to try to work some of the areas. And some of the areas I'm going to want to dry, so I don't want to go too quick in some of the areas. But that's the balancing act of working with markers. Alright, since it's a pretty wet area there, I'm going to let that dry until I do anything else to it. So meanwhile, I can move on to another area. So I already know that I'm going to do the wheels in the same way as the cab. And it might seem like jumping around a little bit, but to me, if I've already got the markers out, they're over off screen over here. If I've already got them out, I might as well work the area that they're in. So again, hit the blender area, and then in this case, I'm going to be a little bit more deliberate than the last one that I demoed, because I want the wheels to have a certain look. So rather than just kind of hitting everything as hard as I can with ink in a single pass, I'm going to be a little bit more careful than the last example. So putting a little bit of colorless blender down first before you put the marker tone down will give the marker something to bleed into and will naturally have a soft edge. There's limitations to how that works, but if you're working with a light value, like a number 1 cool gray, then it will work. And certainly if anybody has any questions along the way, please, I'm happy to answer anything. So while those two things are doing that, this is probably dry enough to add another value into. Let's see what I want to add here. And some of these things you can just go ahead and hit one time in the very beginning and go, yep, that's the value, I'm sticking with it. But you can end up sometimes with holidays as well, and that's like an area where there's marker, but there's a lot of white spots. But that can actually happen also if you use too much ink, and depends on the paper you're using. So there's a balancing act to everything. Because inks and papers will only take so much abuse before they just say, no, we can't take any more. And then they don't. They just stop doing stuff. So what I'm doing now is darkening the shadow underneath the door handle and the mirror. I always find that to be a really good detail to add, because it just helps add some shadow and some reflection to the area. So I'll probably go over and darken those up again with something else. I'm trying to jump around the basic grays and carefully tint these areas, because I'd rather build them up a little bit than accidentally put too much down too quick, which can happen very easily. Alright, jamming right along. Is that Bristol paper? Actually, this is just marker paper. So this is Canson Pro Layout marker paper. It's intended for markers. Works great with solvent-based markers and alcohol markers. But I used to do all my illustrations on Bristol, and then I stopped because the way markers work on Bristol is very, very different. Even a marker-intended Bristol has caveats to it that I don't like for the type of artwork I like to do. So I don't use it anymore. I'm going to still use Bristol, but it's rare that I'll do a final illustration of Bristol. I like how nice things can look on Bristol when they're done, but to me you have to fight the markers a little bit more, and I don't find the end result to be better. As a matter of fact, I find that it makes you work a little bit harder than you need to. Alright, so while I'm waiting other areas to dry, I pretty much always jump around. And because I'm not using a reference for lighting or color or anything like that, I just kind of do my own thing based on, you know, some level of experience of where I think I need to put value and color. but also keeps me from just sitting around waiting for something to dry either. There's always areas that need to be worked, and if I've got all my materials out, I might as well just jump right into it. So I'm just starting to add a little bit of value to the areas that I'm going to do as chrome or polished stainless. You can kind of make some of those decisions as I go, but I'm going to start somewhere. And a lot of the details for the trim work will be done with paint way at the end. We're a million steps away from that. The paper looks thin, like printer paper. Must be strong as F. It's actually thinner than printer paper. It's really thin. I don't know if the camera will be able to pick that up. It's really thin. So marker paper, like vellum paper, is really delicate. So you have to work with it very carefully. But because it's coated on the back side, it's very strong, and it can take a lot of abuse of the materials as long as you're not pushing too hard. Admittedly, Bristol will give you a whole lot more strength. You can really push on Bristol a lot harder than marker paper, which seems like it would, score 1 for Bristol, but everything comes with trade-offs. So I would rather deal with the trade-offs of this. But every artist is different. Every artist has the thing that's going to determine, what materials you're going to use will be based on your comfort level, what you're after as an end result, and so on and so forth. So while I'm working those areas a little bit, and I still have my basic grays set out here. Excuse me just a second. I'm actually gonna. And probably won't show up exactly on on the camera because the color correction does look a little bit unusual. But basic grays are just a teensy bit very purple, which does not sound very basic at all, but I didn't name these things. And it seems sort of obtuse to use something like that. Like, why would you want to add light purple to anything? It just makes things a little more interesting in the value range of everything. If you used really neutral colors for everything, it ends up looking kind of boring. All right, so I'm going to leave a lot of these areas open, of course. It's been a while since I used one of these papers. I forgot some of the stuff, some of the things about them where I'm like, oh yeah, this is why I don't use this paper all the time. Not to mention it's getting harder to find full size, but that's a different problem. All right, so, oh yeah, so I also want to make sure I'm matching my trim areas here. Anything that I'm going to do on the trim areas, I'm usually going to do all at the same time, just so that I don't forget. Again, if I've already got the material in my hand, I might as well just go ahead and use it. And actually, I already know I'm going to do that. Lighting and reflection usually follows a line that follows the contour, and that's kind of an advanced subject, but it'll be a good subject to break down in a video later on, I think. So I'm going to break one of the rules I just said I was probably not going to do, and grab a little bit of pink, if I can find one that's good, and just fill some of these areas here. It's not going to seem like much, but it's going to save me airbrushing in a few places. Let's see. Right. All right. So what paper you use the most then, and how much is marker paper? I only have the markers. I don't know what those markers are, but anyways, marker paper is totally a preference thing. I don't even think that everybody that uses markers uses marker paper, to be perfectly honest, and I can see why. It's not doesn't work in every situation. But what I'm using here is Canson's Pro Layout marker paper, which is only available in certain sizes now, which is a little bit of a bummer, but in any case. I also like Bindfang marker paper, which if you think this is thin, man, The Bindfang paper, or vellum, which is two-sided, is massively thin compared to these. Alright, so usually try to keep some type of duster near me so that I can knock off any of the dust that's there, because if I find any of it on my hand, I'll end up smearing it all over everything while I'm working. So try to keep some of the dust off. So now that I have some of these basic areas down, I'm going to go ahead and plot in the interior. I'm not going to get really carried away because I want this to be sort of a quick illustration. So I don't want to spend, say, all night on it, for example. And seeing how this particular marker is brand new, it wants to go all over the place. Must have sat on the shelf for a while. I'm doing the window gasket at the same time just to try to save myself a step later. Try to look for groups of items that fall in the same value or fall in the same shape, because I'm not looking to just outline everything with marker and work at one thing at a time. I want to close up really, really big areas and shapes with marker so that I can get a nice solid color fill. So that later when I'm airbrushing, I'm just creating the transition areas over top of this rather than trying to weave in and out of every single little detail. It's not super important to me. Oh, markers are $25 a pack. They're cheap, but they don't bleed. That's not bad. You beat the devil out of the bunch. That's funny. Really funny. Alright, so now the interior is basically plotted. There's going to be a couple more detail areas that I'm going to work out in marker, but because I just put it down, it needs to dry. So the next thing I can do then is I'm going to jump back into the wheels just a teensy tiny bit so that I can start to make some shape out of them. And in a later, more involved video, I'll probably explain some of my thinking and how I'm doing the lighting and contouring. Because there's rules to follow and then there's rules to break. And they are not the same. And I'm trying not to get really carried away on the faces of these because it should be an off-white. I don't want to end up making it like dark gray or something, which you pretty easily have happen. But I need these core colors to be a little bit richer. That's kind of why I'm going back and forth on them. Right. Alright, so jamming right along. Starting to get a little bit of shape and a little bit of depth out of everything. It's moving along just fine. Alright, I want to find a cool number 4. There we go. And just start to get a little bit more value into these areas. I don't want to get too carried away. Because I need to leave myself some room to airbrush at a later stage. So yeah, don't get too carried away. Alright, let's see, I need to match this trim real quick. Alrighty, so we're on that. Now I'm sure that this area is probably dry enough. I'm going to switch over to alcohol markers, actually. I'm going to switch over to a Prismacolor. So I find one that I like here. So it might seem a little bit strange to go over, say, solvent-based markers with alcohol, but it's minorly inconsequential. Doesn't matter. So the reason I'm switching is because these markers dry a little bit faster, so the edges that I'm chasing around with the slower drying marker, well, the slower drying marker is going to give me these bigger, cleaner fill areas. The faster drying marker is going to allow me to do some of the more detailed areas a little bit crisper, with a little bit more predictability. Now I can start to slow down and make sure that I'm putting edges in the right place rather than just making shapes and blobs of color. And of course something like window trim or the window gasket is something that's going to need a little bit more precision. So we can either do it in colored pencil or just marker over marker. And you could use like an old marker and get a similar type of effect, but I just prefer to do it this way. And there'll be a limit to what paper can handle in terms of doing this type of thing, but for the sake of illustration, it's pretty harmless. All right, it's jamming right along. So now what I want to do is get a window reflection in there, and I could probably use the same marker that I was just using because it'll be sort of inconsequential. We're still in the really early stages where I'm more or less making shapes for the reflections, for the lighting. And sorry, the camera's right next to my face if it sounds like I'm yelling at you guys. I'm not, I promise. And a lot of this will get airbrushed over, so it's not super important for certain things. Like there's critical parts and uncritical parts. It's kind of a delicate balance to figure out what's super important to get right and what's important to, or what's not as important. Look at me go. All right, anyways, moving right along. So let's see with where we're at. There's a bunch of open areas. All this stuff is going to get airbrushed into, so I don't want to get too excited and jump right into that before I know I'm done with some of the marker stuff. So let's finish up some of this marker stuff. What I'm going to do is, let's see, back to an alcohol marker again. And again, because I'm working in a tighter space, I'll use a marker that's a little bit more predictable, that I can use in a smaller area. I wouldn't normally use an alcohol marker to do the big areas for the exact same reason that I don't use the big area marker for the small areas. Each kind of has a strong point, and I prefer to use them for their capability rather than trying to force one thing to do everything. So since these will allow me to finesse smaller areas a lot more predictably, and the bigger markers will allow me to fill more cleanly, I can just kind of use each for their purpose. Not that I wouldn't use one or the other. It's, you know, whatever your comfort level is, really. But it's just my preference. If I'm at home like I am right now, I'll just use everything that I possibly can since I'm here. But if I'm out on the road at somebody's shop, it won't. I'll do whatever I have to. I won't get picky at that point. So some of these values you can just jump right into. You know, I'm building a bunch of values over top of values, and that's not always necessary. I like to see things come up a little bit more slowly because the result is a little bit more predictable. And to some degree, I think it's a little bit faster. If you just put in colors, like if you have a perfect photo reference and you have markers to match everything, then you can probably get a lot done just by using your photo reference to replicate what you have. But since I don't use a photo reference to render, I like to be a little bit slower and a little bit more patient in some areas. There's also a lot of reasons why I don't like to use photo reference. I prefer the creative freedom to make the color look the way that I want. So the last thing that I want to be doing is leaning on a reference to tell me how I'm going to make my artwork look. If I'm going to draw somebody's vehicle, I might use a reference to figure out what the best angle is or what, but I won't use a reference. I won't use a photo to figure out how I'm going to do color and shape. That makes no sense to me to do it that way. But everybody is different. That might be part of what you like to do. It's just not how I do it, that's all. And leaving a little bit of that purple show through actually has kind of a cool effect. I might use a color like that on one of the undercolors towards the bottom later, it'll probably give it a really cool effect actually. It'll make some magic. You'll notice I've buried my door handle and I've got some edges here and there that are a little unplotted, but it's all going to make sense in the end. So a lot of those details have to be done at the end because of the nature of some of these materials. I could absolutely slow down, drink less coffee, whatever, and have a slightly more predictable end result. But I really like coffee, so here we are. And what you notice I'm doing is taking the window reflection and following it into the body, but I'm doing the reflection to the shape of what the body would do. And that kind of helps give this illusion that the lighting that's going across the window is also coming across the body, that they're relative, they're both going to look glossy. How long could it take me to get decent at marker rendition? That's a good question. I think everything comes down to practice. How much time you're willing to put into learning something will make a really, really big difference. So that's really where the challenge is finding the time to be able to put into something, because it's not easy to do, but it becomes easier with time. But you can't really, you can't cheat the process of learning, because you have to make some mistakes, and it's not necessary to be like bad at something, but your approach to fixing mistakes might be different than somebody else's, and there's no way to figure that out without doing it on your own. So with a decent set of markers and some paper that doesn't make you work too hard, I don't think it would take anybody really long to be really good at markers. And even me, I'm only leaning on markers for the initial stage. I'm going to use tons of different stuff in order to finish this. Alright, so, but to answer your question, I don't think it would take an enormous amount of time, depending on the time you have to put into it. You will absolutely get out of something what you put into it. So if you're really serious about learning, you really got to put some time into the practice, because you can't make, there's no way to synthesize practice, I guess is the best way to say that. Sorry, I'm looking for a particular marker and I'm all the way over here. So I was looking for this really particular color that I use on some of my chrome. So now I'm still putting down more color and more value, and I could have done this, I could have done the blue at any stage, or this is pale indigo at any stage, but I wanted to make some decisions about what the surfaces were going to be. Are they going to be reflective? Like, am I going to do these chromed polish? I thought about doing the truck in a different color, so I kind of keep all the materials out that I think I'm going to use so that I can make some of those decisions as I go. When I'm doing renderings for me just for fun, and no one's telling me what color or how the trim needs to be, I just give myself the space to make these decisions on my own. So I could have come in and done blue first and some warm tones, but depending on the piece, the order can be more and less consequential. I can put in 8 hours per week. I mostly use charcoal and ink, but I want to get fairly decent at colors and markers. Nice. 8 hours a week isn't bad. That's like a whole day of actual work, which is pretty good, I would say. Alright, so with where I'm at, I think the next stage actually will be airbrushing. I think. Like, just kind of look at everything. I'm standing far enough away. The camera's right in my face, so I'm going a little bit cross-eyed here. But to look at everything and just kind of evaluate, because once I start putting airbrush on, I won't have a whole lot more space to do marker again. I could, but I just want to be deliberate with all my stages. If I'm going pretty linear, then things go pretty quick. And for me, something like this is moving along pretty quick, so I just kind of want to stay in that realm. So the next magical part then is airbrush. So I've already got paints mixed up off screen, so the little noise you'll hear in the background is the airbrush compressor coming on. Right. Alright, so I already got colors mixed up, so I'm just going to drop some of the red that I mixed up into my airbrush and safely remove the protective cap. And let's see if I can find an extra piece of paper here. piece of scrap. Alright, so I always want to test the airbrush not on the illustration. I'm sort of doing it here for demo's sake, but this is just scrap piece of paper. I want to make sure that the color temperature is right for the ink that I've mixed, because I generally want to mix something relative to the color that I'm using markers for. It's a mouthful. Alright, on to the next part. And I'm mostly airbrushing in the open areas, but because I've already done all the marker red, I can absolutely go over everything I already have. And because the airbrush paint is going to sit on top of the ink, and sorry if I'm yelling in anyone's ear, because the airbrush paint is going to sit over top of the ink, it's actually going to be more vibrant, because we're kind of layering, and the airbrush paint will be, the marker goes into the paper in most cases, but airbrush paint, like a pencil or paintbrush paint over top, it's going to sit over top of that. So we'll get a little bit more vibrancy out of the color. We can start to lose it as well by burying it, so you want to be careful and deliberate. And I rarely mask when I'm doing these type of illustrations. And the reason being is I like a little bit of a soft edge. Showbox Sam asks, do you use water-based airbrush paint? I do indeed. For example, what I'm using right now is Createx illustration colors. These are my favorite to use for this type of rendering. Everything about them is beyond ideal. But they would be considered an acrylic, like a water base. Yes, absolutely. How much is that airbrush? I don't know how much these go for, but Iwatas are my preferred airbrush. So, but there are entry-level versions. So somebody pointed out earlier, because I'm working on marker paper, you do have to be more careful not to get really carried away with oversaturating the paper, because it'll warp. And that can happen if you go too heavy with markers as well. But even though I like to work incredibly fast, I still know when I need to be patient. And this is the stage where things can go really wrong if you just straight up warp the paper. So slow down, be more careful, be more deliberate. So even though I'm not masking, I'm of course being really careful not to get a ton of overspray in areas. There's obviously going to be some because I'm not masking. And I don't mind some of that because to me it adds a little bit more of a natural look. I don't want a ton of overspray, of course, because then I have more to clean up later. So I don't want to give myself more work. So the airbrush gives it a candy coat. In a way, that's an interesting way to look at it. So the paint is definitely sitting on top of it, but but the paint that I mixed is a solid red. So eventually it will go just red. A candy will go black. You know, this is a pigment, so it's only going to get to red. But theoretically, you could use a genuine candy over top. I just happen to be using it in this way. But because of the way that most airbrush paints are made, it's really vibrant. So it gives you that really good magenta hue over top of everything. I'm sorry if I'm yelling at anybody. The camera is right next to my face. I'm trying to be careful not to overwarp anything, but also get some paint down. Alright, so let's see where I'm at here. A little bit on this guy here. And I'll clean up that edge a little bit later on. In a tight area like this, I might have masked at least a little bit. Maybe sometime that would be good as a demo. But masking is not my preferred way. I want to get a little bit more saturation in some of these areas so that the color looks really rich. What lighting and color does as it gradates tells a lot about the surface that you're on. Or that you're rendering, I should say. I've just about got these areas to where they're not going to get any redder. I've got most of these transitions to where I want them. I'm trying to be careful not just pile paint on, because otherwise it'll give me more to fix towards the end. I'm not trying to make more work for myself, that's for sure. And on camera, it probably doesn't seem like very much is happening, but in real life, so much is happening. Alright, so try to not hit my face on the camera over here. There was a stretch years ago where I was doing a ton of custom painting, airbrushing, and pinstriping on cars. So it's part of where my comfort level with just doing most of this freehand comes from, is I used to do it for a living. So I'm not overly worried about messing up or getting paint where I don't want it. Alright, a little bit up here. Alright, so now with where that's at, kind of made all the transition areas a little bit softer, which is good. It's more or less what I'm after at this stage. While the paint is still in the stage that it's in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an eraser, and I'm actually going to come in and chase some of these edges a little bit. Again, you got to be careful because it's marker paper. It's delicate, really delicate. So I've got the edges taped down. I don't know if you can see it on camera, probably not. And, you know, whisking away with the old duster so that I'm not putting my hands all over everything. And what this is doing, essentially, I'm erasing out some of the paint. I can't remove like a ton, but some of these edges where the overspray goes straight up to the edge, I might want to dial it back just a little bit. And the Createx illustration paints really give the space to do that, so I can get a slightly brighter edge, which I'm still going to come back and detail with paint later, but any stage where I can make a little bit less work for myself in a later stage is good. That's what I want. And by skipping masking, obviously I save myself a ton of work, but you know that also comes with its own consequences, like a little bit of overspray that I can actually erase all of this out of here because it's such a small amount. Because I did so much work with the markers to begin with, there's very little space that needed to be airbrushed, which is good for me. Generally, red to me is a pretty easy, one of the easiest colors to render. And so stuff like this can go pretty quick, as long as you're not trying to break the rules too much. All right. But red is also one of those colors that's a mix of saturation and harsh white highlights, all of which will come towards the end. Alright, let's see, just want to get a little bit of overspray outside of the edge here. A lot of this I'm actually going to come back in with white paint anyways, so I don't want to spend too much time in this stage trying to go, oh man, I should erase all this out. Some of it, yes. I'm totally contradicting what I just said a second ago. Some of it, yes, but for some of the other stages where I know I'm going to do pencil here or marker or something else here, I don't want to get too bogged down. Again, everything is an effort to save time in another stage, hopefully without compromising quality. Alright, so actually I've got all the red exactly the way I want it to be, so I'm going to clean out the red from the airbrush, and then I'm going to switch over to, let's see, what color am I going to switch over to? Probably cool black. Robert Lopez asks, what is the hardest color to render? That's a good question. I would say, give me a moment to think about it. While I clean out the airbrush, I'll think about that one. Still trying to figure out which the hardest color to render. You know what? I know what the answer is. Probably the hardest color to render is light grays and whites, because there's less room for error when you're starting with a white page in the first place. And to get good contrast in a vehicle that you're rendering in a really light value means you have to approach the illustration differently. Not the vehicle portion of the rendering, but the entire illustration differently. So it's just thinking a few other steps related to your end result. Alright, switching colors. I'm hoping that I cleaned up this guy enough. Let's see here. So generally when I use black airbrush paint, or any paint for that matter, I'll always mix in a little bit of blue, because a normal black paint is going to be just a little bit too warm, and to me it can tend to make things look a little bit dirty. So I'm going to tint it a little bit, and always want to double check, make sure everything's working before we get into the windows here. I did mix this a little bit weak, so I'm probably going to have to make a bunch of passes on this one. But there's a reason for me making this one a little extra weak. I'm also going to use it to tint some of the white. So I didn't want something that was going to be too coarse and too grainy. Plus, building up the values like this looks really, really nice. Is this something that can theoretically be done with just marker? Absolutely. This is, to me, certainly faster. I could be wrong. Somebody could be much faster at doing this with marker, but I'm just kind of relinquish each stage to do what I think it's going to be good at for the way that I works. You might have a different way to approach the mix of materials that you like. There's nothing wrong with that. So although I'm trying to get a lot of color right here, I'm not trying to bury it. I'm just trying to get the value and the transition that I'm looking for. But I got to be careful not to warp the area, so I got to let it dry a little bit and dust it on a little bit more than I normally would. And let's say while that area is drying, you know, I might be able to hit some of these areas down here. Just gotta make sure the airbrush is really clean. I know it seems like I'm just painting over a ton of stuff, and I am, but there'll be a rationale for it towards the end, so don't you worry. Just being really careful and really deliberate about where I'm putting this. I could theoretically airbrush this entire thing freehand, but to me it wouldn't be faster and it wouldn't be cleaner. I just want to use each of these materials for what they're good at. Right now I'm just being slow and careful with the airbrush paints so that I don't have to mask. I really don't like masking. Is Steve Stanford an inspiration? Steve Stanford is not only an inspiration, he's a friend of mine. He lives fairly nearby, and I try to go visit him about once a month and steal all of his secrets. No, I'm just kidding. He's a huge inspiration and a great, great guy. So is Foose. I've worked with Foose before, and huge, huge inspiration as well. So at this point I'm more or less just tinting the areas that I did in marker. Again, because I'm trying to get that contrast from putting ink over top, or paint rather, over top of ink. And it's working, we're getting there. Just gotta be careful. Because I've got this black, sorry if I'm yelling at anybody, tinted just a little bit. I need to be careful not to overdo it, because I'll change the color temperature of what I'm working on. Which, you know, some people might not care about, but the details will make a difference to me. Alright, so far so good. Airbrush is only putting up a little bit of a fight, but that's alright. It's another part of just not burying everything with color right away. So I can kind of watch everything take shape so that it can be a little bit more predictable in the end result. Again, if you had like a perfect photo reference and you knew exactly what you're after, you could mix colors directly based on the photo reference, and you could pick markers based on your photo reference as well. It's just not my style. Alright, so let's see. Actually, pretty much got everything tinted, and yep, I'm going to just go a little bit heavier down here. And a lot more of this detail will be done with pencil and paint as we get to that stage, and we're getting there. It's actually taking shape pretty quick. Alright, so real quick, what I want to do before I switch out colors entirely is, again, I'm going to jump in with the eraser and clean off some of this, a little bit of this overspray. It's not overly critical, but the next color I'm going to come in with is the blue to kind of bring the chrome out a little bit, and I need to be really careful with it, but it also will have a different look depending on what it's going over. So if the blue is going over a black, it'll have a different look than if the blue is just going over more of this paper white. So I just want to be deliberate in all these decisions. There's still plenty of room for error in a lot of these things, but again, if you can just kind of save yourself some work by thinking a step ahead or two, why not? You know, a lot of details like the mirror will get a whole lot more paint, the door handle will be entirely paint. You know, so don't worry about stuff at this stage. I'd rather just have these nice clean marker lines and go over this later than try to go around it, because when you go around little details like that, you end up with this pillowed edge around everything unless you're really, really careful. And I just, in the end, I already kind of have an idea of the look that I want, so I don't worry too much about details like that until later, until I'm really slowing down. Alright, so now I'm going to clean out that color. Bear with me just a moment while I switch colors here. Alright. Grabbing my test paper again. And making sure that my airbrush is participating. Doesn't always, so that's why you want to test it first before you start just jamming on what you got going on. Alright, so the next thing that I want to do is bring the blue out in the chrome, because it'll start to give things a bit more pop, and the color temperature will help indicate what's happening a whole lot more, as will the details towards the end, but I also want to have a little bit more control over how I feather this particular color. Because I don't want to just put blue down, like I did that with marker, but I want it to gradate, I want it to transition, and I want it to get richer towards the core. And you could do this with charcoal or chalk. Chalk is another great way to do this, but you know, just like a lot of the stuff I'm doing, I'm already here with the material. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Blue in renderings is something I always have kind of a love-hate relationship with, because you can do blue wrong very quickly. And too much or too little really isn't the issue, it's the color temperature. Because blue, there's a lot of different types of blue out there. So you can end up with something that leans the wrong color direction. It ends up very like tealy and green. And it doesn't look very natural, it's not super flattering. Alright, so our windows are part of our reflective upper areas, so they need to have a little bit of cool temperature as well. You could literally use, well, the vehicle's red. If we were to use like a certain type of yellow as the upper reflection color, it will totally fly so long as you do all of your reflective surfaces that way. The eye just reads the kind of the balance of what's reflective. So as long as all the upper surfaces have the same color cast, they'll feel like they're from the same family, and your mind just thinks they all do the same thing. And that's true. They are all trying to do the same thing. But of course, blue is just pretty straightforward. I'm going to touch up a lot of this with some paint details. But I want to make sure I get the saturation of the blue that I'm after. I don't want to overdo it, but I don't want to underdo it either. In some cases I would rather go further, like hit it too hard. In some cases I would rather dial it back a little bit. But because we're already dealing with, say, red, for example, we already have an oversaturated color. So I'm going to hit some of these upper reflections just a teensy tiny bit. Not a lot, but just a little bit. Because it'll start to give the impression also that these are part of the upper surface. And all the surfaces need to follow the same rules, so that our minds just read them looking the way that we intend. Alright, make sure I didn't miss any questions here. Okay, so far so good. Alright, we're jamming right along. So, that's, I can go a little bit harder on the blue here. Just push the saturation just a little bit more. And it's a little bit inconsequential, but it might make a difference later once I put in all the black, like all around the tires and the grill. A little bit more blue will probably look nice. Plus, it's just going to have a little bit more kapow. Alright, so... Alright, we're good at this stage. I'm going to clean out the airbrush one more time, and then we're going to start working on some of these other details. Oops, I find where to put the crown cap. There it is. Alright. Actually, I might need the blue later. You never know. So I'm just going to leave that sit there for now. And, again, I'm going to go straight back to an eraser here. At every stage, I want to try to clean up a little bit if I can. So long as it's not something I'm already going to do at a later stage, then I'm just going to bury it in paint or whatever. Then I'm just wasting time. But it doesn't matter if I erase as much paint out of this as I think humanly possible. It's still not even going to pop until there's like highlights in it. Alright, so now that portion is done. Cool. So the next thing to do now is the ground shadow. And some people that I've seen will do the ground shadow in the wheels first. And the reason that I don't is because if I'm doing all this marker work and all this airbrush work, then I can just take all this black shadow area and I can cover all that overspray and marker with solid black. Otherwise, the overspray is going into the solid black, or I have to be careful not to use a marker and pick up any black into the wheels. So it's all personal preference-y stuff, but that's just how I jam. So let's see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a Sharpie, actually, and the first thing I'm going to do is run around these ellipses. Of course, I'll use an ellipse tool in most cases to save time or just make sure the accuracy is on point. There's really no reason to gamble with the roundness of wheels. For the wheels to not be round is kind of silly. And a round wheel helps things look a lot more believable, especially if you have a big old mess in between of everything. But if the wheels are round, that really helps. Really adds a lot to the believability if the wheels are round. Alright. And I basically only need to make a single pass on those, because I'm going to come back in with other markers and go around everything else. Got a little tight on that one, but that's alright. I'll come back with some paint towards at the end anyways. But the rest of these lines I'm just going to freehand. Again, Sharpie is an alcohol-based marker, so I can go a little bit slower and be a little bit more deliberate, and it's not going to just create this horrific edge. I did see I left a little bit of an open area there, so I can just grab some pink. Just hit that real quick. And then when I did make this new line work, I keep all the same tools out that I use for the line work so that I can do the line work again later in Sharpie. Or whatever tool I'm going to use for this last part. Or for the shadow part, I mean. Nowhere near done. But those are also lines that I don't want to chase all over the place. There should be some accuracy in them, and the less messy they look, the more believable it is. So now getting towards this stage, I'm going to slow down a bit because I need that increased accuracy. I don't want to gamble by going too quick and end up with a black streak in the middle of an area that I can't clean up. Everything's fixable, but as I'm getting towards the end of something, I don't want to create more problems for me to solve. I just want to finish the piece. And let's see, I'm actually going to do the rest of this in a different type of gray. And contrary to what I just said, where I'm going to be careful about freehanding, I'm going to freehand this. But this is different. It'll make a little bit more sense as I'm working. I could use an ellipse tool to get in there as well. I didn't. I'm just trying to go a little bit quicker. Pick up the pace here a little bit. And I'm not going to do the entire shadow area entire in black. I'm going to leave some of these areas open because I'm going to do them in gray because I don't want to overdo the black shadow part because it can start to look a little bit strange. So, while I've got those outlined, I'm just going to go ahead and hit it with some black. And for anyone who's just jumping in, hi there. Welcome to the thing. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer anything. Otherwise, it's just me talking about whatever it is I'm doing. So I'm happy to answer any questions. So of course, trying to be really deliberate with filling these areas with solid streaks as well, overlapping everything, going all the way up to the edge, because I don't want there to be any streakiness in these areas as well. They'll look super solid if you do them in really wide, careful patterns and overlap the strokes a little bit. Alright, I want to go just to about there, and then I'll do the rest of that in gray, and same here. So the shadow is one of the details that starts to bring the, the rendering onto the page. It's just a step, but it helps. What's up, F100 Garage? How's it going? Man, this is right up your alley. And thank you. Alright, so, since I mentioned that I'm going to do the rest of these in gray, I'm actually going to do them in an alcohol marker. It seems like I'm jumping between brands and marker types a lot, but it's really all about the end result, which we're many, many steps away from, but still, end result nonetheless. Whoop, here's me dropping markers. Alright, so, let's say I know that this is going to be darkest it's going to be, and the lightest it's going to be. That's where things get a little bit tricky. But that actually worked. There's really no specific rationale for why I prefer some of these areas to feather out a little bit more gray than solid black all the way around, except for sometimes that too much black all the way up to the edges can make stuff look a little bit too animation-y. And as much as I like animation, really heavy black outlines and black all the way up to the edges can sometimes give this sort of weird effect. It's different if it's intentional. In this case, it won't be intentional. It will be accidental. Like, I did a little bit of fade out here with the marker and the airbrush, and the shadow kind of following that kind of helps everything gradually go in that direction. So let's see, now that I've kind of got this really harsh cutout around everything, I'm going to soften that up as well, which I could do with an airbrush, but I'm not going to. I could. I'm just not going to. Actually, I'm going to do this with this particular brand gray. And what this will kind of do is pick up the slack between the shadow and the tire. Not like a ton, but enough to where it might actually make a difference. Wow, that is a really wet marker. Okay. Because sometimes harsh shapes can just seem like too much, like on the eyes. It almost can look a little too stickery, which might be a compliment sometimes, but not always. So when I get sort of a feathered edge, which I could have done with an airbrush, I just decided not to. And some of this feathering can even be done with colored pencil at the end, which I still might do some of, just to tighten up some of the tire line or whatever. So yeah, now that's starting to look like a thing. Grab an eraser here and move on to the next thing. Alright, so now that that's cut out, actually, while I'm right in this stage, what I'm going to do is grab a teeny tiny little pen and get these guys taken care of. You'll bug the heck out of me. The Sharpie point is just not quite fine enough to get all the way into certain areas, so let's see. Cool. Alright. It's interesting, the red with the white with the chrome looks very farm truck, that's for sure. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is get these little fill-in areas around the grill so we can start bringing the shape out of that. So I'm going to use the same marker that I used when I did the pen transfer, so that I know everything will sort of make sense. And it can be sort of easy to bury a sketch as you're working along like this. But again, because I'm not using a photo reference, it doesn't really matter. I remember where all the lines are that I put in. I'm not worried. And some of the stuff I'll be able to get okay with the Sharpie, but I'm going to break out a smaller pen so I can get those little tight areas and hopefully not like mess them up too much. Alright, where's my cap? Alright, there it is. Alright, fill in those areas. And there'll be some black line work to do in the trim as well, but I'll save that for its own stage. Not quite there yet. But already we got a lot more shape. Let it cut around everything else that I was working on. So now the contrast is starting to make a little bit more sense too, since there's black against everything else. We pretty much couldn't get much more contrast. Cool. Alright. So that's all at a pretty good stage there. Hey, Matthew Scott, thanks for coming by. Is it difficult to Robert Lopez asks, is it difficult to render patina look on a vehicle? Yes and no. It's not impossible, and it's not like overly difficult, I wouldn't say. It's more like a fun challenge. Not impossible. I've done a lot of patina renders, and I'm certainly not afraid to do so. Although in that format, related to what a different person was asking about using illustration board or Bristol, that's one of the scenarios where I'll almost always use illustration board or Bristol, because I'm going to need to do a lot more paint detail in order to make it believable and make it work. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do, while I'm here and I'm already at the stage, I'm going to start adding a little bit more detail to the chrome. The chrome has this wonderful ability to go from all the way dark to all the way light, and of course reflecting all the colors around at the same time. And we're just on a piece of paper here, so there's really nothing to reflect. Let me grab a piece of paper real quick. So that just means that we have to kind of simplify the look of everything. But we need full contrast. We need some details that go full light and full dark at the same time, because that's the way reflective surfaces work. And there'll be some creative liberties at the same time, some general shapes. But as long as all the materials are following the same rules, they'll all read at least very similar, or from the same family, or otherwise. And a lot of these types of details I will definitely freehand, just because I want to be able to place them where I want. I mean, it's true of the entire rendering. I'm doing all the details the way that I would want anyways. But when it comes to reflections, some of it needs to feel a little bit random so that it can feel organic, and some of it needs to be a little bit formulaic so that it's legible. And that could be a really interesting balance to try to figure out. Again, because I'm not using any photo references, more or less just resigned to figuring out how it's going to look. While I'm working on it. Let's see that little brim line there. Now that I'm not going to freehand because it's just pointless. It'll be faster just to make it perfect. But a little bit of imperfection in reflective surfaces is definitely a good thing. Alright, so now we've definitely got some much harsher lines and shapes in here, which is good. Start to make some of these surfaces feel a little bit more believable. I don't want to overdo it, because then it can get busy and messy. But I do want to kind of go over some of my blue pen lines. Just be a little bit more dramatic, just for the sake of being visually dramatic. No other reason other than that. Because sometimes in artwork, the job is to try to figure out how to make something look cool on a page. And that's where leaning on photo references isn't going to be super helpful. Because then you're definitely at the mercy of whatever picture you found. And that might sound like a good thing. I don't think that it is. Alright, so I'm going to jump over to these little guys. I don't want to get too carried away, because I haven't figured out the exact way that I want to detail these towards the end, so I don't want to overcommit to too many black lines, because those will be hard to cover up later. Not impossible, but hard. Alright, we definitely got a good look going. Things are looking good. Actually, at this stage, I'm using more of a micron type pen to do some of these details, because the ink saturation is going to be really, really clean and really, really nice. But for the sake of finessing details just a little bit better, let me find one. More of a ballpoint pen, because it'll give me just a little bit more control in these areas. And again, I don't necessarily want to just outline everything, which is why I'm doing something a little bit slower and a little bit more controlled, so that I can feather the lines and transition the shapes a little bit, more or less creating line weights, because it just tells a better story visually. If you just outline everything, it'll just look outlined. Cool. Alright, look good. So then, let's switch on back to this mirror here, which I'm going to end up doing a lot of paint detail on. but I can at least get started. And I don't even worry about the handle yet. And let's see, actually I want to get this shape in here. It's reflecting inside of there. Right. Okay, moving right along. I already see all the fancy stuff that I have to clean up in order to make this one look good in the end. A little bit more cleanup than I would like, but it's not the end of the world. There's definitely plenty of soft shapes that I can make hard shapes out of. Like even just all the line work, and this is just the dark line work on the grill, really brings that up a lot. So you can imagine, you know, the seams around the panels, all the things that will really come up as the details come together. Let's see here. So switching back to my front wheel. I don't necessarily want to bury all the pen work that I did. Again, what I'm just creating is contrast. I'll have to come around that ellipse one more time with a colored pencil or some paint to bring it out a little bit more. Because I got a little bit heavy-handed with one of the stages, but again, I'm just creating contrast and some line weight. So I'm not just going over everything that's already there. Because that would be easy. No. It's better to do everything the hard way. Alright. So now that's got a bit more shape and depth to it as well. I can come in here and start to make this guy, except it's a bigger area, so I'll just use a bigger marker. And I can just clean up the marker edges with a different pen. Sweet. Alright, cool. Jamming right along. And let's see. Just kind of following my light pattern here. Cool. Alright. Now on to the back one. Switch back to the ellipses. And obviously it's a different ellipse than the front. The front's a 65 degree and the rear's a 45. They're pretty much always going to be different than each other. If you have ellipses that are exactly the same front to rear, you have an alignment issue. Pretty serious alignment issue, really. Again, we're just creating contrast out of the lines. Don't necessarily just want to go over everything. And I'm trying not to hit my face on the camera. Alright. Almost successful. Now that I have 10,000 markers out, it's super easy to find the one I'm looking for. I want to make sure that I'm more or less doing the same lighting formula and the shape and the contouring formula from wheel to wheel so that everything kind of looks like it's in the same family. We don't want to start changing rules in the middle of an illustration. Yeah, it will definitely look like we changed rules in the middle of an illustration. It does happen from time to time, but still, we don't want to. Alright, well, that's more or less that part. And a lot of this is going to come down to some pencil and paint details, which is actually next. There's really not very much left to do in the pen stage here. Now we're kind of down to where all the fancy cleanup areas from all the broad strokes that I made here. So, let's set aside some of these thousands of markers and get them out of the way so that I can comfortably get out the next set of materials, which is going to be pencil, before we jump into the next thing. Okay, so normally when I'm working on pencil details, I'm going to have like a piece of sandpaper out, so that not only am I sharpening everything just with a general sharpener anyways, I'm also going to be able to file down the tips a lot more predictably. That way I'm not just sharpening and sharpening and sharpening, because then you'll end up with these teeny little pencil nubs that I already have anyways, that just get harder and harder to manage the details. But you notice as the areas are getting smaller, the detail tools are getting much smaller as well. That's just kind of how it goes. You would take a house roller and try to paint tiny little details, so the tools gotta get smaller. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do, since I still have the ellipses out anyways, is, let's see which guy this is. Not quite. Alright. I think I would remember by now. Is I want to correct this guy. And even though I can do this with paint, I do want to do the initial stage with pencil anyways. It looks like some of this will have to be done with paint anyways, but that's alright. We just kind of need to get everything started. And some of these areas where the ink bled past this little body line here, I'm going to go ahead and clean that up. I'm going to end up cleaning it up with paint as well. We can kind of start the process here, because the details in pencil are going to be a lot softer than the paint details. So even though I'm just going to go over one with the other, some of the edges will be soft and some of them will not be. I want to make sure I keep kicking the material off with a brush instead of my hand, so I'm not loading my hand up with dust and just redispersing it all over the artwork. This is more or less the opportunity to correct some of the marker lines. Now I can grab like a little bit of red and pencil where I didn't maybe fully go all the way up to the lines in some areas. We can do this with like a red pen or as well. I'm doing it in pencil to kind of keep things a little bit simpler. Hey, thanks very much. Thank you, thank you. Alright, so while I'm here, let's see. Well, I've got red pencil out. I'm always looking, so is there something else I can do with this while it's here? Otherwise, I can put it away and be done. And actually, what I'm noticing is I could get this lower area with a little bit more value, just to get the contrast right. In some cases, it's okay to push a little bit harder. Try to keep the paper clean while I'm working. I don't always win the keep the paper clean battle, but man, do I try. Alright, so switch over to black and start doing some of this other line work, because we want to clean up. Actually, here's an area that needs a little bit of red. Alright, so going back to the black pencil, what we'll be able to start to do is clean up some of these edges that maybe got away from me just a teeny tiny bit. And normally if I'm doing like a build rendering or a final rendering for a customer or something, I'd be moving a lot more slowly, a lot more predictably, because I don't want any possibility of having to redo something. But these demo pieces I'll usually move along a whole lot faster like this, for the sake of moving everything along. And some of these details and edges I'll just go ahead and do with pencil. I could also do them with the airbrush, but you know, I'm here at this stage, so I'm just going to use what I've got. Alright, just kind of looking to see what needs a little bit more contrast. The seam around the bed here needs just a little bit. The paint detail line at the end will also help bring this out. I actually think where panels come together can be a nice detail. A lot of stuff that's too smooth and too clean looks sort of weird. Have you ever seen custom cars or vehicles where everything is smooth together? It looks a little unnatural. Like, almost cheap sometimes. Which seems really weird to say, because obviously a lot of work goes into doing that. But I don't think it oftentimes has the desired end result. I'm just going over some of this stuff a little bit more than needs to be, just because I want to create some separation between panels. Let's chase this with the eraser just a little bit to get a slightly more finessed edge out of it. Alright, so let's see. There isn't a ton of detail work to do with this particular truck because it's red and white. It almost couldn't be any simpler than it is. Or at least there's not a ton of detail work to do with pencil. There's going to be a lot to do with paint. And I'm actually kind of itching to get to that stage. But since I'm here, one thing I might do is make a little tire edge here. And reason being, I don't always do it, but since the tire and the fender well and the shadow area all share like the same tone, solid black, this kind of helps split things up a little bit and adds just a teeny tiny detail. I don't always, but in this case I will, just for fun. Time to sharpen the pencil again. Alright. Where was it? Okay. And don't overdo it on tire detail because I'm not rendering tires. I just kind of want something to be there. And while we're here, I can kind of cut this area out a little bit cleaner. Same with that little bit of marker that comes out to the edge there. And I actually want to use a color to go around the shadow color as a detail. I'm just about at the stage where that might sort of make sense to do. Let's see, I'm also picking the reflection area that I'm going to use. And sometimes I'll take pencil and I'll go around some of these other areas that I'm going to paint in, but I'm going to skip that for now because I'm going to paint them in. So I'm not going to get overly carried away with that. Of course, the edge of the bed rails is going to be highlighted, as is part of this body line. Yeah, I'll clean this one up while I'm here. I always thought watching these would be super boring, especially at this stage. I'm just working on tiny little details. I cannot imagine this would be super fun to watch, but all about the end result. Alright, I'll switch over to a finer white pencil for some of the details. Actually, real quick, while I'm here, got to go around this guy. And I'm not trying to get like solid coverage out of the pencil, just trying to create a transition line. Alright, so back to the very thin pencil. I'll create some of these details a little bit crisper. Let's see, like the very edge of the window gasket is a nice one to highlight. Just kind of helps show that there's a difference between the shapes. I mean, there's a highlight there in real life, but you can get pretty carried away with it accidentally pretty easily. And that's why I'm doing it with pencil and not with paint, because it's pretty easy to get carried away and just start outlining everything. And then before you know it, you've outlined everything. Alright, while I'm here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do part of this window reflection. I'm going to paint part of this as well. But I at least want to get it started this way, so that the paint is trying to cover a value that's similar to it. Will hopefully make for less paint. And then maybe I'll get just a little bit more here so that we can have a slightly more interesting thing there. There we go. Let's bring this all the way up. Cool. And I'm using the eraser to kind of go back and forth with the pencil a little bit. And because, you know, it's marker and airbrush, at a certain point, the eraser isn't going to take marker off of the page. So it's reasonably forgiving in that way. And now we have a pretty cool window reflection going. Probably won't do much interior. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm thinking now, I wonder if I should do something a little bit different way with the interior than I did. But I still got time to make up my mind. So I don't have to worry about it just yet. The door handle, I already know I'm just going to 100% paint. It's not going to waste the time with pencil. Otherwise, let's see what else. We've got this edge here for the hood. And again, I don't want to just outline everything. I want to suggest the edge of it, because it wouldn't look very natural if it was super outlined either. But if the outline was missing, that also wouldn't look very natural. So now we can do the door edge here. And we don't necessarily want to run those all the way to the bottom. Especially not that one. Or any of this one for that matter. Normally I would rotate the page so that I could look at things a little bit square, but I can't rotate it because there's a camera. Well, that's okay. Doing the details in the pencil means I can change my mind a few times. All right, jamming right along. You know how you have something set right next to you and then all of a sudden it's gone? Yeah, all the time. All the time. Sorry. Right. Okay. So then the next thing I want to do is highlight this edge just a little bit. But again, I don't want to just outline it end to end. I just want to imply an edge. If you're just outlining stuff, you're just outlining stuff. It's not not helpful to the illustration to just outline everything. Although at some stages it can feel like it, but it's not what we're doing. And these stupid little details like the inner fender edges don't really matter that much, but you know, sometimes it's the little things in an illustration that actually make the biggest difference anyways. Alright, so I'm still kind of making my mind if I want to do anything with this window area. Actually, I'll probably just leave it the way it is and maybe just tint the bench a little bit. Since we're looking through the glass, obviously it's tinted, so since we're looking through the glass, we don't need to get too carried away. So it can be a little bit softer, and that's totally fine. But maybe we've got a little seat pattern split up here. Maybe it'll have kind of a diamond cut. But I don't want to get too carried away. And then say in the case if I feel like, oh, I just got a little bit too much line work and contrast in there, I can take just a little eraser, kind of come in here and soften this up a little bit. So I want to imply that it's there, but I don't necessarily want to be stuck with like staring at lines, especially in a pattern like that. All right, so let's see what else. There's a couple other pencil lines, and then we can switch on over to paint details, the fun stuff. All right. So just kind of finishing up some of the pencil work here. Just kind of checking, reevaluating, making sure everything's good. Let's see. So many tools out now. I have to figure out where everything is. Always looking for that one thing that I just set down. There it is. Okay. All right. So before I do the paint details, the last thing that I want to do with pencil actually is probably some type of just bottom outline color. And I think I know what color I want to use. Cool. Bear with me just a moment here. It's just kind of for the sake of variety. I think this purple will look really cool. I don't need to put a ton of it down, but yeah, I was thinking either purple or green. I think green might be a little too on the nose. And there's definitely a rationale for which colors to choose to do something like this, but it's probably a slightly more advanced topic. But we're definitely just doing something here for the sake of illustration. This is just a matter of making things look extra fun and cool. Because in the end, it's still supposed to be a piece of artwork. You know, I'd want somebody that bought this or commissioned this to feel really cool about having something fun to hang. So making art choices that are really safe is kind of boring and predictable. So even though it might seem like an odd decision to make, like outlining everything in purple real quick, I think it's actually kind of a really cool detail. And plus I can maybe fix the shape of the tire if I got something a little bit out of shape before, but I'm not outlining in black now, so I'm not creating this high level contrast problem that I have to solve. I think the green probably would have worked as well, but like I said, it just felt like it'd be a little on the nose. Yeah, a little bit of this black marker could probably come out a little bit, so I'm just going to chase it with a little bit of colored pencil. So it doesn't seem like a harsh pickup. Definitely getting some extra fingerprints in this one. As much as I try to keep everything clean, I still kind of keep going back and forth with this little kneaded eraser, just to try to pick up as much of the fingerprints and junk that happen throughout the process, because there's some inevitability to it. Just gotta try to be careful is all. Alright, actually, it might not show up much on camera, but the purple looks really, really cool. Alright, so if I can just stop myself from doing any more there. Oh wait, I just saw something else I needed to detail. See, this is what happens. If you try to go fast with something, you'll end up slowing down towards the end anyways to fix all these little details or edges or whatever. Stuff that may or may not make a difference, but it can. There's also a reality to over-detailing stuff and it not, you really start to lose on your return when you start putting too much in there. I see what's happening. My French curves are really messy. That's what's happening. Well, good thing I'm almost done with them. Hey, thanks, Roger Lindsay. The details, the last 10% of anything is really what starts to make things make shape. You know, maybe 30 or 40 minutes ago, everything was just kind of soft, blobby shapes in the nature of marker and airbrush. It's just how they look, or at least the way that I do it. It's the way that things look. There's other people that do everything with marker, everything with airbrush, and they can keep everything neat and clean and tidy the whole way through. But I like this version of the details coming together at the end. And there's still plenty of details left to go. So without further ado, let's jump into those. I'm going to clear off some of the stuff off my desk so I don't accidentally kick over anything that I don't need. And switch over to paint. So bear with me just a moment while I clean off a few things here. How's everybody else doing? I realize it's getting late. Appreciate that you all came out to hang out and watch paint dry with me. It's pretty nice. It's pretty nice. Alright, let's see. Cool. Alright, so now so I'm going to take some AcrylaGouache and paint in some of these details. And it may or may not seem like there's already too many details, not enough details, whatever. I always feel like there's not enough until it's completely done. That's what makes a difference to me. But realize, yeah, everybody kind of has their own way to go to get to their end result. But this is where the cool stuff happens, I think. All the bling. I'm just going to pick out a few paintbrushes here. I have like a million. Of course, I use the same 3 all the time. So I have all of these paintbrushes. Makes no sense, but whatever. Anyways. Alright, try to keep my hands clean here. Cool. And we're going to just get right into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is some of the long lines. And essentially I've got paint in the cup and I've got water in the cup at the same time. So I can just kind of palette it right there. Then I can just kind of get the paint until I feel like I've got the drag and the feel that I'm looking for. and then go straight on for it. Just gotta cross my fingers and hope that everything goes right. And that I don't hit my face on the camera. Now these lines, of course, I want to do in a single passes. Some of them, they'll have to be seams because long lines need more paint or whatever the deal is. But some of the lines can look really unnatural if they have too many seams, just like a tattoo. Certainly in contrast to, say, the colored pencil, where we can still cover up some of the mistakes and start to build highlights, the paint creates really, really harsh edges, which is good. This helps us to find some shapes and really, really make some hot spots. And so in the case of like that, because I'm using gouache, I can actually clean up the paint while I'm working too, as long as I do everything while it's wet. And something like this, I'll probably do a little outline around everything because there's a little bit of overspray, and I kind of like the way that a painted outline looks. Even though I spent a bunch of time talking about not outlining everything, I'm totally not outlining everything. Splashing a little water here. Gotta be careful with the marker paper. Unfortunately, this will be the stage where I'm doing the least amount of talking because I'm trying to concentrate on lines. So bear with me if it's a little quiet. But I'll try not to make it boring. As with the entire process, you know, each step is going to be a little bit slower so it can be a little bit more precise. I don't mind kind of jumping really into the first handful of steps, like putting in tons of color initially, because I want those areas to be big and expressive right away. But as we're working on the details, we don't necessarily want the details to be expressive, because I don't think that's a thing. Now what we want is a level of accuracy in the detail, so that even if I did something really weird in the reflections, I could still make something believable by the details being in the right place. Or at least hopefully. I mean, even come back in and repaint some areas, like how I'll do the door handle. And in paintbrushes, you're really just limited to the size of the brush and your patience. And a lot of cases, I'll repaint in huge amounts of area. I'll do the entire wheels just in paintbrush details, depending on the wheel, because that might be the level of accuracy I need in order to get the look that I'm after. Or it might be a really complex wheel. So I'm going to be careful with the details to not overdo it, but also don't want to underdo it either. It's pretty easy to go either way. Because we want to define some of the shapes and the edges, but again, like every other stage, I don't necessarily just want to outline everything. Otherwise, I'm just outlining everything. And for anyone that didn't already hear me say that I'm not using a photo reference, you know, I'm sorting out the lighting and the reflections as I go, but I've done this about 1,000,000 times. So to me, there's not really much question mark about where I'm going to put everything. Because I've done these before, and plenty of F100s at that. Alright, so some of the lines are going to be heavier than others, that's for sure. And the important thing to kind of do is to vary the line weight. It will make a difference to have some lines that are wider and some that are narrower. That's essentially what line weight is. But that'd be a great topic to cover in its own video. Here I'm just using a wet paintbrush to soften the edge of the paint up a little bit there. Now, even though I'm saying I'm not going to outline everything, some of the edges are going to seem like I'm outlining stuff, like this one, for example. But the reason being is the type of edge that it is. It needs a little bit of outline in order to be defined a little bit harsher, because I had initially gone around it with pencil, and that will do some of the legwork, but not all of it. So I want a slightly harsher outline to kind of define that edge a little bit more. But again, I'm not just outlining everything. I'm outlining seams and edges that are pointed upwards. Hey, thanks very much, Bill. And thank you for coming to check it out. So I'm going to let some of these details in here dry. This is, while I'm going slower, it's also trickier to remember that now that I'm using paint has a different window of dry time than the other stages. And that's my telephone. I'm going to get a little bit more line weight into the edge here, just to imply the upper surface just a little bit harder. Alright, let's see. Actually, I'm going to do a similar thing. Hopefully I'm not blocking too much light out. Some of these areas that I did preliminary in pencil, I knew I was going to go over with paint, which in some cases is like, I should have just done it in paint and not wasted any time, but yeah, win some, lose some, that's for sure. Alright, so let's see. While I'm working on some of the bigger harsh reflection areas, what I could do, let's say, is this area right here. Even though I've done a bit of an airbrush transition in there, what gives things the sense of being glossy, as far as the surface, is these really crisp, hard, reflective highlights. There does need to be some soft reflections as well, so we can't just go around every area in the same way, but it's a balancing act. So like with any of the other stages, I'm kind of looking at everything, seeing really where contrast needs to go, because that's what's going to give something the appeal of being shiny or not. And in general, contrast in illustration just looks good. Spent plenty of time on the nose here. It's definitely time to move on to some of the other detail areas. I still have some details left to do. Actually, it's gouache. It's already dry. I'll go ahead and just go ahead and put them in, because I want, let's see, obviously, just a little too wet there. Lower portion of the headlight. which the paint is transparent, so some of the blue will still show through, and at this stage I don't mind the harsh contrast. And I'll do a hard highlight in there with a bigger brush towards the end, but at this stage I just want to make sure I've indicated that light shape a little bit better. Alright, so the next thing, let's see, maybe I can get this guy going. And kind of use the paint to transition into the pencil there. It literally sounds like there's an ice cream truck outside. Seems like a really inappropriate time of day. Got some paint on my hand. Alright, so what I'm really doing is mixing the difference between pencil and painted details. Because the paint details will create a nice harsh line and the pencil details will transition into nice soft lines. Which is cool. That's good. I'm going to try to get to the details a little bit quick through this one so we get this guy wrapped up. Alright, we're getting there. I'm going to grab a red pen real quick. Sorry. Just going to clean up a back edge here. So that shape looks a little bit better. Let's see what it says. So at this stage, as I'm getting closer to the end, I can start to look, what needs a little bit more detail, what needs to be outlined in what way. Ideally, most things at this stage I'm going to do with paint. But it doesn't mean I can't switch over to one of the other tools and fix something else. If I see it, I feel like I have to do something. I gotta do something about it. So now I can paint in the door handle real quick. And just do the initial pass. I'll come back in with some, either some marker or a ballpoint pen once this paint is dried. But that's essentially why I don't really worry too much about burying it in paint through the process, or marker through the process, because I'm just going to redo it anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Alright, so while I'm working around some of these outside areas, just need a little bit more paint in there. Sort of like painting over some of the overspray. It'll look a little bit more harsh while it's wet, but once it dries, it'll settle a little bit better. I could have just masked it and it would have been fine, but for the sake of demo, I like to try to move through these things as quickly as I think I can. might seem like this one maybe took a little time, but actually moving along through this one pretty good for the type of piece that it is. You might also notice that my initial sketch that I went over is done in blue lines. And one of the reasons for that, not only because I think Bic pens and blue pen sketches just look really, really cool, also the final outlines that I have towards the edge, I didn't just do these really harsh lines, they're line weighted, so it's a little heavier towards these close edges and a little fainter here, and that's just from freehand kind of just doing these sketches lightly. But if I were to do it in black pen, or a black marker, or like a liner or something like that, it can make things look really, really animation-y and cartoony. And I think that's something a lot of artists accidentally do, is outline everything in black. And it's fine if it's your intended look, but it can be a little bit distracting. I could literally do paint detail stuff like this forever, and usually this is the hang up of where I spend the most time anyways, because this is the accurate stuff. This is where I can clean up as many of the mistakes as I made, or I can create new shapes that I wasn't able to do with other tools. This is really the stage to me that makes the most difference. So oftentimes this will be where I slow down, just kind of settle in, make a cup of coffee. Because lack of detail or bad detail would be enough to ruin anything, especially at this stage, when it's so close to being done and reasonably well balanced. I still have all the bright highlights to do, of course, but I'm kind of still looking around at some of these areas and lines I need to do before we get there. But we'll get there. Almost there, I swear. Alright, so this horizon line, I want a lot more contrast. So I'm just going to paint it in. And then while I'm here and I've got the paint out, I'm just going to go ahead and fix these fender well, or yeah, this little detail will look a little crisper if it's painted. And there's probably a more appropriate way to do this, but it's just how I do them. Again, I got to be careful because it's marker paper. It's not going to take a whole lot of abuse with wet paint and a paintbrush, but already that line looks a whole lot better. Might not look that different on camera, but from here it looks a whole lot better. And it's one of those types. There's always going to be little details that are like, man, that just really makes something look terrible. And some of that stuff, some of the choppiness of the way really wet markers look can do that. Alright. I'll give the paintbrush a break for just a second. And we're going to break out a little ballpoint pen. Should be better safe than sorry. That's that. Cool. Alright, moving right along. Back to the paintbrush. There are plenty of steps that I could skip if I was at somebody's shop and I had really, really limited time to work. There are certain details that I would skip just for the sake of keeping things moving along. But I want to make sure this demo is as thorough as possible. A lot of times if I'm out at a shop working, I might have 30 minutes or an hour to work on something in its entirety. So I'm not going to get too hung up on little details like this. Because it won't matter, especially in an idea where someone's like, I don't really like the way that looks. Well, if we're doing something conceptual, then we don't want to waste a whole lot of time at that stage. Sorry. Trying to find a pen. And I didn't find it. I'll just have to use a different pen. So just trying to tighten up some of these lines while I'm here. Again, this is where everything kind of gets slowed down. Try to figure out where to be more precise and where to be more careful. The last thing we want is details going in the wrong area. Alright. And I'm gonna, or maybe it will seem really obvious, but I'm working on this top down. This is a flat desk that I'm working on, as opposed to like an easel or something. Alright, so actually that's all of the paint details for the body, short of the major highlights. So now I can start to work on the wheels a little bit more. Which there won't be like a ton of detail in, but probably enough to matter. So some of these I wanted to go around again anyways. And because I use the ellipse tool in the first place, I have the perfect roadmap. As long as I'm patient and I don't get carried away. And many of these details in here are for the chrome or otherwise. They're going to be the last big fat highlights, which we're just about there. So I'm just kind of nitpicking a couple of details at the moment, but getting there, almost done. I'm trying so hard not to hit my face on the camera. It's in exactly the wrong spot. If I draw this a little bit bigger, I can have the camera a little bit further away, but win some, lose some. Alright. Now we can get to the big fun stuff. I'm going to add just a little bit more paint to the mix of what I have. Just so I have something fresh. And it won't really take much. So make sure I've got a decent brush for blending, just in case I need to. And pick up a nice fat brush for some of these bigger, heavier highlights. And it looks like it's time for a new detail brush. This one's probably seen better days. It most certainly has. So these are more or less the highlights that are just the hardest, biggest reflection highlights. So they'll give kind of the bling in the end. And it's easy to want to try to get to these a little bit sooner. But if you put them in too soon, then you have to work around them. And that's no fun. This paintbrush has definitely seen better days. But we're going to make it work. So these bigger highlights are really the opportunity to get the harshest contrast out of everything. Which might seem why it's obvious to save them for last. Now that everything's on there, it's a lot easier to figure out what the balance will be. Or where things need a little bit more balance. Alright, so just gonna keep working with the big highlights and hope that my paintbrush hangs on long enough. Sometimes the first pass with some of these paints is just a little bit transparent, not like crazy transparent, but it can work as a benefit as well. So you'll see me make a couple of passes on a single detail so that I can get a little bit more pop out of it. Yeah, of course being strategic where highlights goes is really important as well, because highlights just don't go everywhere. Of course you can put them everywhere. This might not look super good. There's a little bit of a formula to how, at least the way that I do highlights, might be nice to cover in a later video, or a video all by itself. Because a lot of the stuff that I do, it seems like, probably could have its own tutorial. And because I'm not classically trained, I could be doing everything wrong for all I know. But it works. It's about the end result. Oh man, 2 hours, 20 minutes in. Thought this would be a faster one. This one went slower than the last one. Here I thought I was picking a faster color. Oh well. This is actually probably the perspective I drew it in. Left a little bit more room for work. Not a bad thing, just. It just went on for a little while. So I'm trying to be really selective of where I'm putting these highlights, like, just like every other stage. I don't want to just keep outlining everything. Some things need a bigger, harsher outline than, say, the last set of outlines. And that's okay, but we don't want to just keep repeating the steps from one stage to the next. Some of these little bumpy edge highlights can help things look a little bit more realistic too. Or at least a little bit more interesting. So close. But it's all these crazy, teeny tiny little details that will really make a difference in a final illustration. Sometimes it might seem like it's just overkill, but we're looking at a drawing of something on a piece of paper. We want to make that look as interesting as possible. And also believable, but, interesting. You want it to be fun. We want the job to be fun, too. If we're just replicating photos, that doesn't seem like a whole lot of fun to me. But to each their own. Just about there. Alright. It's down to some bigger highlights towards the wheels once I get some of these in here. Bear with me, changing directions for a second. And I did need to get a highlight into these real quick. It's nice and bright and harsh. But all these little silly details make a difference, I'm sure of it. Might get a little bit of color in here. And almost ready to do the wheels. Alright, now we can get into the wheels. Finally. Not that there's really going to be a whole lot of detail here, it's just, white wheel with a chrome cap and a chrome lip. Cool. All right, getting there, getting there, getting there. And now we just gotta match the front wheel to that, or the rear wheel, sorry. Which is the hard one, because that's where the camera is, apparently. All right, almost there. Feels like I've been saying that for a while. Just finessing some of these details just a little bit. Before we get in the last couple of big ones here. A nice flat highlight on the rim. I have just a couple little line details left to go around some of these guys. I actually want to go around that just a little bit. And just about done with all these unnecessary little teeny tiny details. A little overkill for a demo, but that's alright. Cool. Cool. I think everything looks good. I think we're about done there. I think. I better just commit to being done before I see something. No, it's good. It's good. Alright, so. And the last thing to do is to sign this guy. So I'm going to find a pen that works. That one barely works. That one almost works. Man, striking out with pens. Alright, we'll go tried and true with the Uniball then. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate you hanging out, and I hope that was helpful. Hopefully this is a decent enough video that I can edit down to more of a tutorial format. Otherwise, I'll be able to post a time lapse. But thank you guys again so much for coming by to check it out.